Welcome, class. Hey, so we're doing Manifest Destiny for this chapter. Manifest Destiny is definitely one of the important kind of early expansion chapters and phases of U.S. history. Is going to lead us into the later sections where the United States has definitely expanded, has more confidence in itself, more capability. And we're going to be looking today at how that entire process came to be, how the U.S. government was making incentives and allowing new immigrants to push westward, how those new immigration policies affected territories that Native Americans and Mexicans lived in, and what kind of lasting ramifications perhaps we can discuss towards the modern day, because there is definitely some conversation as towards early manifest destiny policies also being implemented today by the United States, and we'll kind of see what this term means, and kind of go from there. So hopefully you like today's lecture, and definitely next week we're going to post up the next two. So let's go through some of the slides. So today, some topics to consider would be manifest destiny. What is it? And what's the definition? How it came to be? The term itself. Who the author was. Number two, Native American experiences to manifest destiny and governmental policies. So here we're going to be seeing, as people are moving westward, how Native Americans are responding to such movements and kind of the dynamics between the two. Three, the Texas Revolution and Mexican-American War, causes, effects of those, and resulting land acquisitions in the West. And finally, number four, Chinese experiences in the West, because we cannot talk about, let's say, California history without discussing some of the Chinese immigrant experiences on the railroads and the gold rush, and building up California. Yeah, pretty much. So let's get into it. So starting off with part one of Manifest Destiny. What was/is manifest destiny? So it is the idea that God has endowed the United States with the kind of inalienable right to expand from the east to the west, from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, why was this sort of mantra, a thing? How did it become into fruition? So essentially, at this point in time, in the early to mid and moving on into the late 1800s, the United States was, on the up and up. They were growing, they were expanding. Immigration was steady because they essentially did not have too many engagements and wars, that were hard fought and pressed. The U.S. was just naturally just expanding. And so they were enjoying kind of unprecedented moment of just prosperity, right? And expanding west as much as possible. Obviously, yes, to the detriment of the Mexicans, which were the inheritors of the Spaniards, and to Native Americans, obviously, on genocidal levels, as we're going to see. But many who were living in the United States at the time, in the eastern states, were feeling great about themselves, right? The United States was, just exploding with all of this innovation and money and business, farmland, right? And so if you were an American or an immigrant coming to the shores of the United States at the time, you were definitely feeling that, the U.S. is expanding. No one's going to stop us. All of these, all of these Spaniards and these quote-unquote Indians, right? They can't stop us as well. So why not? God has endowed the United States with so much prosperity and power. It should be within our right to expand as much as possible. Now, as historians, we do have to obviously take this with a grain of salt. We cannot put our modern conceptions into, let's say, the mindsets of these individuals going back into the past. So we have to view it within the lens of the time period, right? So at times, try to disconnect yourself right, from kind of modern conceptions and try to piece this together, right, from the time period. And so folks were feeling good about themselves, and millions of Americans and white settlers, mostly white settlers from Europe, were pushing west in the early to mid 1800s. Now, they were also being aided with the fact that, number one, they had large population numbers. There were various things going on in Europe at that time, whether it was a lack of land, perhaps food starvation, wars, pestilence, whatever. And so let's say if you're a European farmer or a peasant, right, or something close to that, or perhaps you own a shop, you're trading goods, but life is not great for you. At that point in time, you were just hearing about America, right? You were reading in the newspapers, or hearing from back from your brothers or sisters or cousins that the United States is filled with opportunity. And so you're kind of like looking around at your environment and you're thinking to yourself, dear God, life can be better than this. And so people in the millions were moving towards the United States for a better life, for that American dream, right? And so they had numbers on their side. They were pushing westward. Number two, the U.S. government also was helping them with governmental policy. So it was not only sufficient for millions of people to be kind of moving and migrating westward, but it was also necessary for the U.S. government to publicly broadcast to the world that, please send us your best, send us your immigrants, right? We want to expand. And so what's the best way to do that? Especially in the early days of the 1800s, where most of the people in the world were still farmers. They were still tied to the land. They were tied to agriculture in some way. So the best rallying cry for immigration was giving people land. That was the best way. And so we have the Homestead Act of 1862, which the U.S. government promised every individual upwards of 160 acres of land. Now, if you live in Los Angeles and land is hard to come by and you have a small parcel of land that doesn't look like much and somehow it's worth $2 million, right? Getting 160 acres of land, that's a steal. And especially if you're, like I said, living in Europe, as your conditions are not too great at that time. And so you're saying, I could stay in Europe, right? And kind of lived my quote unquote glamorous life here. Right? Not that much stuff is going on. I can't elevate myself socioeconomically too quickly here. Versus the U.S. government is literally just handing out 160 acres of land. Why not? And so this was a major catalyst for immigration into the United States, as you could imagine. Now, the painting here on the left-hand side is quintessential manifest destiny at its finest. This is a painting from John Gast, 1872, called American Progress. I was lucky to view this painting at the museum. It's currently, I believe it's still housed at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles, right across from the LA Zoo. And I was there, a few months ago, maybe a year ago, kind of just browsing around at the Autry Museum. And suddenly, I just saw the painting, American Progress, and I had to just do a double take, because during my undergraduate at UCLA, having a U.S. history course, this painting, American Progress, is quintessential, right, for like manifest destiny at the time itself. And so, in my kind of mind and conception, I'm like, oh, that's probably like a huge canvas somewhere, a huge tapestry. This is like, some glorious thing. But at the museum, it was like a tiny little painting. So I kind of just quickly saw that. I'm like, I had to do a double take. I'm like, is this the famous painting that I was studying for all those years? But yes, you can see it at the Autry Museum if you have time. But this painting is amazing, and we'll kind of try to go into it in detail here. So here we have the central figure, Lady Liberty, right? Or representing the United States, or the spirit of the U.S. And this entire painting represents the push westward and everything that it encapsulates. And we'll kind of go through some of the various bits and pieces. So in her hand, she has a school book and she has a telegram wire. And so the school book can represent she is bringing education and civilization to the masses, right? To all of this uncivilized land. The telephone wire, or the telegram wire, I should say, is bringing technological revolution to these untouched, pristine lands. Also, we are seeing various railroads pushing westward. We see what looks to be like a Wells Fargo bank, right, like a horse carriage, going westward as well. On the bottom right and on the very bottom, we are seeing farmers and settlers also pushing westward. And if we're comparing all of the scenes to the right, technology, railroads, telegraph lines, right, agricultural farming practices, compared to what the painting represents on the left-hand side, untouched land, buffalo and wild animals roaming freely, Native Americans who are not, clothed. We see on the left-hand side the women are bare-chested. And then far onto the left-hand side, in the back, we see Native Americans doing what looks to be perhaps a sun dance or a moon dance, right? So still kind of, quote-unquote, stuck in their ritualistic ways, right? This painting is supposed to kind of show that mentality of manifest destiny, of our way is better. Technology and progress is better than whatever you are doing with the land. Look at you and your untouched, pristine land. You have not done anything with that land. You have not cultivated it and kind of made it your own in a very Eurocentric European viewpoint. And my last point here would be also, from like an art history, I guess, artistic perspective. If you're looking at the lighting of the painting, the right-hand side, which portrays quote-unquote civilization, cities, etc., is in the sun. The left-hand side, the untouched, pristine land of the Native Americans, is dark and cloudy. And so that also represents that we are the light. We are spreading the goodness and education and technology, right, into these lands. And we will illuminate this darkness that you have about you. And so on so many levels, this painting just represents, so much of manifest destiny. And is definitely something you should remember for the exam. Now, here we have the manifest mentality. Where did the term manifest destiny actually come from and begin? Now, the term had a very specific origin. It was coined by a magazine editor, John OSullivan, in 1845. He wrote it in his various magazine and reviews. And, quote unquote, it was our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our multiplying millions. And so here we can see he's describing the fact that they're having millions of people come in, and the population is, of course, booming. And so they need some place to put those individuals, right? And so, he is definitely kind of encapsulating the social feeling of the time. Now, he originally wrote this to describe expanding into Texas, because Texas was having issues with the Mexican government at that time. And so perhaps he was thinking that the United States was going to push into Texas and kind of absorb it into its hegemony. However, obviously the United States was going to take that to the next level, not only take over Texas, but have the Mexican-American War and push all the way to the Pacific. And so the overall thinking of Americans during this time were that they are spreading towards the Pacific Ocean. They are spreading their culture, their customs, and that their way is better because they are militarily winning, right? And so once you have that momentum building and pushing, then that starts to tell yourself that, oh, well, our way is the way. And so kind of all other thoughts of incorporating different ideals and customs and cultures and religions and kind of growing and learning from a very a multi-layered perspective, right, is kind of being diminished here. And also, as we are pushing westward, we're not going to get it too heavily today, but Protestants and missionaries also made a big deal about pushing westward and expanding into these new lands because from a religious perspective, all of these people Not the Spaniards and the Mexicans, right? Because they worship Jesus Christ and God as well under Catholicism. But at least the Native Americans, they were from the Protestant side, right? Seen as heathens. They were sinners. They did not believe in Jesus Christ. They were needing of, repentance. They needed to be converted, and for the shining light of God to be, shown to them. And so also, as people are moving westward in a kind of general social kind of way, people are saying we have to spread technology to these people. They're not using the land properly. We will use the land properly. No one is really stopping our push westward, so God must be on our side. And then speaking of God, these poor heathens, we have to spread the light of God into their lives, right? And so all of this multi-layered facets that we can look at. This kind of represents some of the movement westward. If any of you in elementary school were going through the Oregon Trail and other kind of such discussions and games, people on their wagons were just pushing west. You just you got as much cattle as you could, some horses, put everything into your wagon, all your belongings and possessions, and you were pushing westward and trying to claim your land. Speaking of claiming land, I forgot one major thing. For the Homestead Act of 1862, as people are trying to claim that land, there was a certain amount of requirements for receiving the 160 acres of land. You had to be there for at least 5 years. You had to be 21 years or older. And you also had to make improvements to the land. That was important. And so, being there for 5+ years, right, it's not too hard. Age range, also not more that difficult. But what does it mean to improve the land? So essentially, it could be as simple as putting up a picket fence and marking your territory and boundary on your land and building, like, let's say, a log cabin. It did not have to be so crazy with development, right, to be considered cultivated. And so so many people were, packing up their wagons, right, just with, a few various tools for house building and to start farming and picket fences and whatnot, and they were just, right, pushing onward. And so some of the natural scenery was absolutely beautiful and splendid, as you might imagine, right, because this was untouched land. Yes, Native Americans were living through here, for, many, many generations. However, the Native Americans, unlike Americans and Europeans, they did not completely dominate the land in a very Eurocentric way. It's a very European mentality to look at a piece of beautiful scenery and nature and saying, I will manipulate this land to suit me and my needs. The Native American perspective was, we are living with the land, right? The land is bountiful and protects us and feeds us, etc. So it was a more symbiotic relationship. And so obviously, as they're kind of going through here, it's, just beautiful scenery. Now, these mountains in the background remind me of a wonderful story. Many years ago, I went to a trip into Montana with a few friends of mine. It was a school trip from Glendale Community College. And we remapped the Lewis and Clark expedition that our wonderful mentor, took us on. And, we were canoeing like 10 to 15 miles a day, right? Going down river every single day, camping on the banks of the river, right? Very beautiful and pristine, views. A lot of mosquitoes, but still a great experience. And then on one of the days, right, I'm in my hat. I have all of the sunscreen on me, right? We're kind of just rowing. And I couldn't remember how many miles we were in, but I just remember that my arms were tired. I'm under the beating sun. And then, similar to here, so we were rowing downstream, and to the right of us, we had this huge cliff face, just like here. These gorgeous, huge mountains. And the water kind of calmed down a little bit, so we were just kind of floating, just doing our thing. And then, the clouds, just like here, was a little cloudy, right? So not too much sun was there that day. And then you know how once cloud cover starts to dissipate a little bit and rays of sunshine start to go through, right? So at that moment, a few rays of sunshine started to go through, and I was like, oh, wow, that's beautiful. And then I kid you not, because it's Montana, and so there's some of them there, on the very top of the mountain, a bald eagle starts to fly down. And I can clearly tell it's a bald eagle from the sight of it. And so I'm thinking to myself, beautiful rays of sunshine hitting the mountain face. There's a bald eagle flying majestically. And I'm like, this is the most American thing I'm ever going to do in my life, right? And that just like encapsulates, I could just imagine some of the explorers and travelers kind of going through, and kind of in a Manifest Destiny or Lewis and Clark expedition type of scenario, right? I guess a nice plug. Go to Montana. It's beautiful. Some of the more other kind of artworks available here are, seen here with, people traveling with not only their wagons and belongings and possessions, but husbands, wives, children, babies. And so this is really, truly a family affair. This is not just a military, a military push. This is, families, right? Traveling together. Two things that are also important. On the very top of this little hill or mountain, we see two gentlemen, and they're going to raise the American flag and place it on the mountain. So that, personifies nationalism. It personifies that we're doing this for the United States as Americans, right? And so that nationalistic mindset is really setting in. And then on the left-hand side of the painting, we can see the ocean. So this painting is supposed to say, right, we are traveling through all of this scenery to hopefully get to the Pacific Ocean one day. And so much to be seen and analyzed here. And this is a map representation showing kind of the general overall push and just how large this expanse of land was. So, as folks are moving into what here is labeled the Missouri Territory, or, the Louisiana Purchase, right? For those of you who remember from your other U.S. history courses, people are, pushing into this blue sphere of the Louisiana Purchase. And then after that, they are trying to push even further west. We are going to see just how much they're going to push in, and inevitably, as you can imagine, because in the green we have the Spanish Empire, the Spanish territories, that they are going to start butting heads with the Spaniards. And we will see how that unfolds. But just to give you a general overarching viewpoint, right? If you're living in, let's say, the yellow territory at this point in time, and then suddenly Louisiana Purchase is available, it almost doubles the size, or maybe perhaps does double the size of the U.S. And people are just like, this amazing, right? So much land for us to come in and push in and get our acres of land. So as you can imagine, that starts to affect the mentality of people, right, moving westward. I love this because eventually this is going to come into play in our other sections as well. But, this is a wonderful political cartoon. Puck was a magazine that made great political cartoons back in the day. And here it's Uncle Sam, right, kind of in his chair, just sleeping and just, daydreaming a little bit. With obviously his bald eagle, and kind of daydreaming of, U.S. expansion, right? And so this kind of personifies Manifest Destiny once again of the United States, or Uncle Sam, or America getting into fights with people, right? Expanding. On the bottom left-hand side, telling all of these Native Americans or Asians, whoever else, it's like, nope, I am here, part of the Monroe Doctrine. I am going to conquer. There's nothing you can do, right, at sword point. And so this is going to come to play later on as the U.S. starts building and growing and expanding. It seems like it's almost a never-ending expansion, right, of military, political, and social, dominance kind of moving through. So obviously that's why people started to grow a bit of a, hubris mentality. Now, this is from John OSullivan himself. And this is a direct quote on some primary source. And so he says here, who will set limits on our onward march? And so this is a poignant critique on how they viewed expansion, how they viewed their role in, let's say, Native American experiences, and just how they viewed their role within the world and under God, right? So let's go through some of this and perhaps analyze it. So America is destined for better deeds. It is our unparalleled glory that we have no reminiscence of battlefields, but in defense of humanity, of the oppressed of all nations, of the rights of conscience, the rights of personal enfranchisement. Our annals describe no scenes of horrid carnage, where men were led on by hundreds of thousands to slay one another, dupes and victims to emperors, kings, nobles, demons in the human form called heroes. We have had patriots to defend our homes, our liberties, but no aspirants to crowns or thrones. Nor have the American people ever suffered themselves to be led on by wicked ambition to depopulate the land, to spread desolation far and wide, that a human being might be placed on a seat of supremacy. The expansive future is our arena, and for our history. We are entering on its untrodden space, with the truths of God in our minds, beneficent objects in our hearts, and with a clear conscience unsullied by the past. We are the nation of human progress, and who will, what can, set limits on our onward march. Providence is with us, and no earthly power can. Now, this is a very interesting quote by Mr. Sullivan. So essentially, I've underlined some of the important parts here. So let's say the glory. It is our unparalleled glory, right, to move through. So it is a very kind of glorified aspect of them moving through with no reminiscence of battlefield. So essentially, they don't have to fight for this land. They're just pushing on through, right? Our annals, or our histories, describe no scenes of horrid carnage. So he's saying we're not slaying hundreds of thousands of people here. We're just pushing on. We are moving on and migrating. Now, this is obviously not completely true, because the Native Americans experience a horrific genocide, both biological warfare, many of them being unfortunately ravaged by disease, and then on top of that, various battles, right, between the collective tribes in the United States Army resulted in more horrid carnage. And so this is a kind of glorified political kind of message here. Next, our wicked ambition to depopulate the land. So he's saying we don't have any ambition to depopulate the land, right? All we want is a seat of supremacy amongst human beings. We are entering on its untrodden space. That's interesting, because once again, they're viewing this land and saying, oh, well, it's untrodden. There's nothing here. It is pristine, untouched land. That is not true. Native Americans have been living there for generations. And so the fact that he is saying this is completely open space just goes to show the mentality and viewpoint of Americans in the United States at that time. We are going with a clear conscience. They have no reservations about what they're doing, because when God bestows upon you the right to expand territorially, who's to say anything against you, right? God has given you that permission. We are a nation of human progress, and providence is with us, and no earthly power can kind of stop us. So here, I mean, they're just saying so much. We are pushing westward, no resistance. We are the epitome of human progress. God is with us, right? So much in this quote from Sullivan. Part 2, Native Americans. Let me drink a little water before. These lectures, they get me thirsty. Alrighty. Native Americans. I like to start off this section by discussing a little snapshot. Sitting Bull, right? Some of his experiences and some of the things that he thought about and discussed, right? In terms of Americans and expansion and, let's say, the whites. Sitting Bull was a Native American, born in 1830 to the Sioux tribe in Dakota, and he grew up hearing stories of incoming whites, the kind of unstoppable white tide of migration. Now, he did not want to believe it because some of these stories just seem too fabricated, right? They seem unreal to a certain extent. However, later on, once he was older, still a young man, probably his late teens, he visited the city of Chicago, and his mind was blown away. He saw all of these tall buildings, street lamps, paper money, glass windows, etc. Now, coming from a completely living on the land type of mentality, right, in a Native American, tribe, and coming towards civilization, quote unquote, right, the city and industrialization for the first time ever, and just seeing all of this, he probably thought to himself, dear God, the stories are true, right? Like, how is this going to affect us? Now, fast forward a few decades, and Sitting Bull ends up becoming a leader within his tribe and others, right? He starts becoming a charismatic voice to defend his people and their way of life. And so militarily, he starts to butt heads with the U.S. Army, which is pushing westward. And for anyone who's heard of Custer's Last Stand, this was Lieutenant General George Custer, who was very hot-headed, and he wanted, quick glory. And so he took his cavalry troops into Native American territory, right? Deep into the territory without reinforcements. So obviously, Sitting Bull, being a military strategist himself, surrounds them and kills them to the last man. And this famously became Custer's Last Stand, kind of immortalizing itself into American mythos and mythology. That this was the last stand of Custer, right? Gloriously fighting against the Native American onslaught. Obviously, there's two sides to the story. And so those young children of the Manifest Destiny era, right? The white settlers, hearing the story of, General George Custer, they're getting a completely different version than, let's say, the Native Americans, saying there was an invading army that wanted to rape and pillage our villages, and we stopped them. So completely different narratives. And so Sitting Bull, after the Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of Little Bighorn, right, technically speaking, Custer's Last Stand is more of a nickname, he becomes this nationwide sensation because he is Sitting Bull, right? He is that general that defeated, right, the Custer's Last Stand army. And so he was obviously on like the number one list for the U.S. government to find at that time. So he retreated to Canada for a little bit for some hiatus, right? To let things cool down a little bit. And so there in Canada, they heard of his legacy too, and they're like, we want to speak to you. So newspapers and journalists were trying to talk with him. And in the various talks, they were trying to ask him, like, oh, well, why did you slaughter these men? Well, what was your reason for fighting? And then he poignantly just said, like, what the heck are you guys talking about? He's like, here, in the quote, what did I do? We did not go outside of our own country to seek them. They came to us on our own land and would surely have trampled down and slain our women and children. So he's saying, what's the conversation here? We had an enemy invading force coming to our home territory without us provoking them. What else were we supposed to do? So this goes to show you some of the different dynamics of the time and the different narratives that are spun. So after that, after his little stint in Canada, he ended up coming back down to the United States once the quote-unquote heat wore off a little bit, and he got saved amnesty back to the United States. And he ended up going on an acting trope, which is essentially an acting... what's the word for it? Like a tour, right? So he went on a tour across the United States with Wild West Show, and he toured with Buffalo Bill, and so this was like a dynamic duo pair. And so you would travel across the United States, right? Charge people tickets and admissions to look at your show, and so right, they were making a name for themselves, and they were charging money for their, performances. And then after a few years of that, he started getting a bit weary. And so he went back to the Sioux Nation. And he even said in his later memoirs that he was tired of white people, right? And he wanted to go home. So Sitting Bull is definitely a wonderful story and encapsulation of both the Native American experience, a general experience, militarily, right? And this, even kind of socially, right? And going into entertainment and, kind of trying to, live off of and profit off of the unfortunate situations that happened in the previous years. And so, although most pioneers, it's, kind of important to point out and say, although most pioneers in westward expansion, kind of migrants and immigrants from Europe, they did not necessarily on their bucket list say, I want to go to America for a new life. Number 2, I want to kill every single Native American and commit massive genocide. That's not on their bucket list of things to do. But it does, it is a conversation to have, obviously, and important to note that just because of their massive amounts of numbers, things were not going well for Native Americans, both biologically speaking and them getting pushed off of their land. Hopefully a fair comparison to this would be in terms of global warming. And let's say not even global warming, let's say environmental impact, right? We always see the photographs of, let's say, the oceans filled with plastic and just all of this garbage and muck. Now, individually, we all do not hate the dolphins and the whales. We do not want to just pollute the earth. Collectively, billions of us, right? Trash gets accumulated and negative consequences occur. So if that's a fair comparison, maybe. From one of the texts that I have, The Ethnic Dimension in America by Olson, this is a wonderful quote here. But the collective impact of millions of ambitious settlers moved across the landscape with government backing, translated into political and economic catastrophe for Indian people and Latinos. So, a very poignant, description of such large numbers having such a large impact. Now, here's Mr. Sitting Bull on the left-hand side, looking very statesmanly, looking like a chief. On the right-hand side, it is partner in crime, Mr. Buffalo Bill. So when they were going on that tour together, right? Here's a video down here when you have some spare time. Please look at that. It's only like a couple minutes long, but it details in good primary source video some early on footage of some of their shows, some of the troop members in there. So if you could imagine yourself at the very beginning, it's kind of the outside of the tent. And so people are kind of selling tickets and kind of having a little bit of a festival. And then once you come inside, they show a bunch of kind of Native American troops, right, kind of on horseback. And then the U.S. cavalry on troops comes in. It's sort of like a reenactment of, right, the last battle or something like that. But it's very, very cool to see. So definitely in your spare time, watch that, please. The culture clash. So as immigrants and sort of, Europeans and Americans are all pushing west, there obviously is going inevitably to be a culture clash. They do not have the same culture as Native Americans and vice versa. And so as the westward expansion is pushing, and obviously the white settlers were having a much more advantageous time through this engagement than Native Americans were, and they were in a more stronger position to dictate the transfer of culture from one group to another. Christian missionaries started to think to themselves, okay, what do we do with these people who do not believe in Jesus Christ? We must save them. They were thinking either to acculturate or assimilate Native Americans. Now, what is the difference between acculturation and assimilation? Assimilation, with the second term, assimilation is the utter and complete control and dominance of culture. So if you come into my country, you will completely change yourself. You will speak my language, you will worship my gods, you will eat my food, you will completely become part of the host country or the host culture. Acculturation is a mutual beneficial exchange, right, of culture. So let's say the Chinese that ended up coming to California. And here in Los Angeles, we have Chinatown. And so initially, once Chinatown starts to get created and grows over time, it's an exchange of culture. The surrounding folks who are living around Chinatown are eating Chinese food, appreciating the culture, perhaps celebrating Chinese New Year's with some of their new friends. And obviously, those individuals within Chinatown who are now becoming Chinese Americans, they are retaining their cultural roots as Chinese, but also incorporating some American ideals in language and stuff as well. So, right? However, the Christian missionaries sought the first method, assimilation. They wanted Native Americans to completely become accepting of the superior individualism that capitalism offered, instead of the tribal communalism that they live under. They wanted them to be Christians instead of worshiping their gods, worshiping nature, worshiping the sun and the river and the trees, etc. They wanted them to begin commercial farming on set lands, not only migrating from place to place, right, depending on the seasons. And obviously speak English over all other native tongues. And so the Christian missionaries really did attempt to completely assimilate the Native Americans into their sphere. Now, obviously, this is going to have some repercussions. I'll show and discuss one military repercussion and one cultural, sociological repercussion. The Tecumseh resistance happened because a Shawnee war chief and his brother joined with a few other military tribes, and they were resenting all of this, Christian missionary assimilation policies, and so they militarily wanted to fight them. I can't disagree with that, but unfortunately, the tribes were divisive amongst themselves, and old tribal conflicts began to, divide them. And so a divided people ended up being a conquered people. And so it was, they could not muster as powerful of a military resistance as they initially hoped. Let's look at a sociological difference. The Great Cherokee Experiment. Now, the Cherokee people, the Cherokee Nation, was very interesting because they pretty much saw the writing on the wall. The Cherokee people and the Cherokee Nation saw that settlers are coming in the millions. Militarily, they cannot stand up against the might of all of these new guns and cannons and railroads and machinery. And so they said to themselves, okay, if they want us to adopt white customs, let's adopt white customs. At least we're going to be safe, right, if we do so. And so they adopted white customs, and they formulated their own legal code. They developed their own written characters for, syllables, published newspapers, books, Bibles, because they converted to Christianity, opened schools, churches, established permanent farming settlements and permanent, living quarters, like everything that they wanted them to do on paper, right? But it was not good enough. And eventually they were pushed out because of westward expansion, because different settlers wanted their lands in the east for cotton production and some tobacco production as well. And later on, we were going to have President Andrew Jackson with the Trail of Tears that we're going to see in a second. Now, it's poignant to, and it's important to understand how some of this discovery aspect happened. Because we keep talking about westward expansion, pushing through land, but how does this land get claimed? Who exactly is able to say, or let's say put an American flag in the Native American territory and say, this is part of the United States now. We claim it. So we're going to have to go a little bit back in history to understand where all of these thought processes came from. So discovery and superior use. Initially, when we had European colonization, and the Spanish and the Portuguese were moving through the Americas, they were the first Europeans here, right, en masse for expansion and colonization. And so for them, it was easy. Plant a Spanish flag and say, this is New Spain. This is part of España now, right? And so they were able to lay, quote unquote, lay claim to huge swaths of land, right? Whether they actually controlled it or not, that was not important, right? Because obviously they can't control all of this new land that they know nothing of, and they have not made any new settlements yet. But for the sake of argument, you plant your flag there, and this is like, yeehaw, this is our land. However, later on, once the British, the French, the Dutch started to get into the game too, and coming to the Americas, you cannot have all of these European powers just laying flags and, you know, laying claim to one part of the land and the other, because it's going to get too messy. Land, territory claims are going to start overlapping with one another. So they needed a more effective, efficient way to measure their colonization. And so in 1758, the Law of Nations was written by Emmerich von Vettel. And this proclaimed the quote-unquote superior use policy, where Europeans were laying claim to this land because they argued that they were making a superior use of it. They were using the land in a better and more beneficial way and aspect than the Native Americans. Their arguments were, look at the Native Americans. They are not cultivating or developing the land. We will. And so that started to become the basis of European expansion here. And we see this in the Supreme Court case, 1823, Johnson v. Miantosh, where two individuals had conflicting titles of the same land. One was from Native American, the other one was from the federal government. And Chief Justice Marshall awarded it to the government's sale because he said that the government and the whites were going to make superior use of the land, and he used that specific language in his defense, right? And this is to describe some of the things I was discussing with like laying claim to the land. Obviously, if you're like coming in and you're just like painting furiously, right, and you know, making all of this colorized version on these huge acres of land, you don't own all of it. Maybe you had one or two cities or forts here and there, but like if you're going deep into the territory, it's just they're just kind of generally just saying we own it, right? So it's just something to be said with quote unquote laying claim to land. Just another version, another map of this. Let's get into the Trail of Tears. So, the Trail of Tears was beginning with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, but in its totality, I believe that the Trail of Tears extends a couple of decades, not merely over 1 or 2 years, because initially it was referred to as the Trail of Tears due to kind of a singular event of like a majority of people walking and being forcefully migrated from one place to another. But in my opinion, this began the systematic replacing and regrouping and restructuring of all these individuals in their lives. And so, however you want to look at this. But President Andrew Jackson, the man on the $20 bill, and interestingly enough, the portrait that President Donald Trump has in his Oval Office to hopefully get some of his spiritual guidance from. Andrew Jackson hated Native Americans. He abhorred them. He was a military leader and he fought many campaigns against them. And he saw many of his troops die in these skirmishes. So he thought of them poorly. He thought they were savages. He thought that they did not deserve to live in this land, that they were that they were not using the land properly, all of these different arguments. And so he ended up not listening or caring about anything else, and so he started to forcibly relocate these individuals because of an executive order, right? The Indian Removal Act. And so it became known as the Trail of Tears because 100 plus thousand Native Americans were transported and began the transportation process to Oklahoma. At that point in time, Oklahoma was kind of this far away state, still on the borders of the West, that many of the white settlers had not settled into yet. So it's kind of just like, send them to Oklahoma, right? And so and let me go through some of these various examples to kind of detail some of the experiences that some of the Native American tribes had during these relocation processes, and which is pretty brutal. In 1831, the Choctaws marched through the winter, where many of them were starving and dying from disease and hunger, and also frostbite. Your limbs start to lose feeling and blacken. 1835, the Creeks suffered massive white attacks in Georgia and Alabama. Many of them were on the trail walking, and then some of the immigrants and the white settlers did not like them because historically they either had conflicts with them or raids from one group or another. So they took that as an opportunity, especially because they were being marched at gunpoint by the armies and the military, just to throw stuff at them, beat them, chuck things at them, perhaps for some of the women, steal and rape them. It was absolutely terrible and devastating. 1837, the Cherokees. Remember we spoke about that great Cherokee nation? And they attempted to assimilate as much as possible. Here we see a assimilation struggle, and we'll discuss this. Once President Andrew Jackson ordered for the Cherokee people to move from the East Coast to Oklahoma, this random place they never knew. They fought it legally in the courts because they were completely kind of like assimilated. They spoke English, they educated themselves, they were building permanent housings and settlements, etc., right? They were Americanized. They fought it through the legal courts, and they said this is not right. Even the United States Supreme Court favored with the Cherokees and said that they cannot be removed. But President Andrew Jackson did not care. So he did not honor the decision, and he ordered the soldiers and the troops to evict them, leading to thousands of deaths. The Seminoles in Florida, that's a great example. They waged guerrilla warfare against the U.S. government. What is a guerrilla warfare? It is not warfare between guerrillas, right? I get that sometimes. But guerrilla warfare is, if you cannot fully stand against the military might of the other power, right, head to head in army versus army capacity, guerrilla warfare is you have a smaller force and you are trying to pick your battles and do as much damage as possible to the enemy force and then retreat. So for example, if the superior military force is, let's say, marching through a forest, the smaller force will implement guerrilla warfare on them and, let's say, hide and then ambush them, maybe take a few pot shots, kill a number of them, and by the time the guys kind of regroup and are going to start to fire back at them, they run away into the forest. And so you do that over and over again. So hit and run tactics, right? Inflict as much damage as possible, retreat. Inflict as much damage as possible, retreat. And so they cost the U.S. government thousands of deaths and soldiers and $55 million in damages. So as far as the Seminoles were concerned, they essentially said, we do not agree with any of this, and we will make you pay dearly. Unfortunately, Seminoles eventually had to succumb to it in Florida as well. And then you might think to yourself, oh, well, Native Americans, let's say, they were getting pushed more and more and more west. Finally, whatever Native Americans found themselves in California, right, at the edge, the Pacific Ocean is here. They're like, finally, we can have some peace, hopefully. And of course, the gold rush is found in 1849. It seems as though they cannot catch a break. And so the gold rush was this monumental, also, just like the Homestead Act, but a lightning rod for everyone to come around the world, because suddenly California hills are streaming with gold, right? And you can go and dig and kind of mine for gold nuggets, and you can make a fortune, right, supposedly. And so people were coming in the thousands. And so obviously that led to more disease, more fighting, some forced slave labor, etc., and Native Americans did not have that great experience in California as well. And so my ultimate conclusion here is that Native Americans eventually were forced to settle down on barren reservations through land claims. Many of these reservation lands were not their first choice. They were not their ancestral homes as well. But it's a system that they chose. And so the reservation system today is, suiting them as best as possible. We're not going to get too heavily into that, right? That's another conversation. But currently, many of them live on reservations in the United States where they are semi-autonomous locations with their own governments and their own laws and legal systems. Here's a political cartoon depicting the Cherokee Nation. And all of the railroads and different union parties and different, kind of interest groups at B and the United States courts, everything. And it's kind of just pinning the giant down, and he's immobilized, signifying that all of these powers at B, they were, they were pinning down the Native Americans, right? There was nothing that they could have done, right? So all these political cartoons really hit the nail on the head sometimes. Native American recap. So just to kind of recap everything. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed the government to bring in 160 acres of land towards every individual who made it to the United States. A huge lightning rod for immigration. We had 5 transcontinental railroads also being built at this time. Because on top of all of our conversations of migrations, the railroads allowed for people to move at an even faster pace. And so, it expedited all of the immigration and all of the pushing off of the land and all of the conflicts that would ensue. And also, number 3, another big factor was buffalo herds. Especially in the Great Plains in the middle of the United States, buffalo herds were a quintessential part of Native American life and their economy. Whenever they killed a buffalo, they would strip it of every aspect, right? The fur, the meat, the horn, everything, right? They would use it entirely. It was part of their way of life. Many of the Americans, and especially the military, they understood this. And so they thought that if they destroy and annihilate and kill the buffalo, that it would force the Native Americans in the Great Plains to migrate elsewhere. So a much easier way of forcing them to migrate because you're destroying their livelihood. And so many of them would start to go in and just for sport, kill the buffalo. If we have reports of if they're riding on trains, right? Like on the train railroad through some territory, and let's say you saw this huge buffalo herd. You and the boys would just get some guns and then start taking pot shots into the herd to kill a bunch of them, and that's it. You would just lay them out there and leave them to rot, right? So by the time any Native Americans would come over, many of them were rotting on the ground and unusable for meat or eating or anything else. And the buffaloes in the Midwest used to count in the millions. And then by the time all of these extermination policies ran their course, they went on the endangered species list. So it was absolutely crazy to think of that. If you have time, please watch this video. It's only like 2 minutes long. It's from the Smithsonian Museum, kind of doing a nice little recap and detail of the Trail of Tears, and also shows some beautiful, nice graphics of the actual maps, right? And like the trails that the individuals had to take to Oklahoma. Part 3, Wars and Immigration. So, as we are moving westward even more, remember I gave you that map saying that the Louisiana Purchase was opened up and people were pushing and moving forward, and that the Spanish Empire was still there. So, the Spanish Empire itself, as far as the Mexican territory, what we know is today Mexico, they had a revolution. They revolted against Spain. We're not going to get too heavily into that. We're kind of going to fast forward a little bit. So by the time we're reaching the mid-1800s here, the Spanish territory is no longer in control of Spain. It is under control of the Mexican government, right? And so during a certain point of time, we had the Mexican government see a certain individual, Santa Anna. He was a general, and he became the leader, Santa Anna. And he rose to power, and he began to destabilize the local governments in the various territories that they owned, and because he wanted to consolidate power for himself. And so this created a terrible dynamic because the outlying regions were unhappy over this change and wanted to rebel. One of those rebelling territories was Texas. And so Texas began to rebel and fight, and eventually, right, these kind of famous pitched battles like the Alamo and such, eventually they kept saying that they wanted to be admitted into the United States, right, over time and time again. And so eventually the United States obliged them, and in 1945 they annexed Texas as the Lone Star Republic and created it as the 28th state in the Union. And to annex a territory is to, not necessarily forcibly, it could be other means too, but you acquire a state territory, right? And this was the main divisive issue. Mexico and Santa Anna were upset that the United States incorporated Texas, right, their northeastern province at that time, into the United States. And so that was enough tension for them to go at it. And so the Mexican-American War breaks out over a 2-year period. Eventually, between both sides, the American troops ended up getting the best of the Mexican troops. And they ended up pushing into Mexico City in 1848, ultimately. And ultimately, they have them sit down and sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which did 2 important things. Number 1, or 3 important things, actually. Number 1, the border between the 2 new nations was now going to be on the Rio Grande River, the same border that we have today. Number 2, it gobbled up all of this territory west of Texas. Well, number 1, they got Texas, which is huge. And then they gobbled up the rest of these. California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Kansas, Wyoming. An enormous amount of territory pushing literally now all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So in one fell swoop, it was almost as large of an acquisition as the Louisiana Purchase. And then boom, just, once again, added so much extra territory to the U.S., feeding into the manifest destiny, right, narrative. And number 3, as the war was winding down, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo also said that the residents, the Mexican residents and the citizens had a choice. They had an opportunity whether to stay where they were, right, which is now being incorporated into the United States and converts and becoming Americans, or they can move south towards Mexico and retain their Mexican citizenship. But it also stipulated that if the people would stay where they were and became American citizens, that the U.S. government would treat them kindly. Now, this was obviously not always the case, as many Mexican Americans were facing discrimination over time. This video on the bottom right gives you a nice little recap of the Mexican-American War and kind of details it within like 3 minutes or so. So if you want a little recap, please watch the video. Texas Revolution. Remember the Alamo. This is a slightly longer form. This is approximately, I believe, 14 minutes, something like that. But it details very nicely the developments of the Mexican government destabilizing, Santa Anna coming to power, and the Texas Revolution unfolding. So if you want a 14-minute little recap of what was the Texas Revolution, how did the Alamo go, how did some of the initial pitched battles go, and how did the Texas ultimately get incorporated as the 28th state of the United States, a great little feature from Feature History here to watch. And then as far as the Mexican-American War go, please, if you have time, watch these couple videos once again. It'll give you a nice overall recap of the Mexican-American War and some of the causes and effects and ultimate repercussions. The Oregon Trail. Has anyone ever played this game? I know some of you might be a little younger, and you're like, what is this pixelated mess? This doesn't look like Fortnite. But the Oregon Trail is a good, fun game. Back when I was a kid, like this was on like the old, like huge desktop computers, and like you would play the Oregon game. And so it's a fun game, but it's a terrible game at the same time. Because you are essentially one of those families who are going through the Oregon Trail trying to make it to the west, right? But you would probably die on the way there. So you would start off, saying I either want to be, I forgot what the options were, but like either like a banker or a butcher or whatever, right? You chose your profession, and then you just made your way through. And occasionally you had various choices, how much food to buy, how much to travel, etc. But typically this was the end result. Kevin has typhoid, and then you would die. Or Kevin or whoever else got bit by a snake, or you starved to death or something, right? So typically you would just keep dying. But if you were smart enough and you know how to play the game, eventually you would be rewarded with this beautiful pixelated view of Oregon. Congratulations, you have made it to Oregon. Let's see how many points you've received. And so I like to put this in because the Oregon Trail obviously was not as like sunshine and rainbows. The Oregon Trail was pretty, just terrible. Honestly, it was an extremely difficult journey. But let's go through the Oregon Trail, shall we? And there were multiple trails of this. Let me show it here. So let's say if you're starting from the Midwest, right? And all of this territory has now been acquired after the Mexican-American War. So there's all of these trails you can do. Essentially migration trails to move westward. The Oregon Trail was becoming one of the more famous ones because just like the Homestead Act, many people during this time were still farmers. They wanted land to farm, and they heard that Oregon was green, lush, that it rained often, which it does. If anyone's been up to Oregon, it's just green as far as the eye can see. And so that was the ultimate goal. However, what they don't show on this map is near Nevada and Utah and Idaho, there's the Rocky Mountains, right? This enormous mountain face that is very difficult to cross, especially if you're just going on foot with a wagon with 4 little shoddy wheels. And so the Oregon Trail itself, obviously people were trying to go and gun it for the rich soils, the thick forests, the beautiful temperatures, etc. And so the Oregon fever started to, begin. Oh, like we have to get to Oregon. That's the place to be. That's the place to go. So thousands upon thousands of people were crossing the Great Plains, the Great Basin, the Rocky Mountains to make it to this glorified, famed land of Oregon. Obviously, on the way there, things would not always work out, just like the game implies. And so starvation, disease, Native American raids, whatever happened, people were dying en masse. It was very difficult to get to Oregon. However, an interesting thing that I want to note, as things became more difficult and the journey was very perilous, gender disparities began to close. So men and women started doing equal amounts of work. So in a day and age, in a time when, men and women were expected to have different gender roles, right, in the relationship, during these difficult moments of survival, we see that gender disparities were kind of closing. So they were doing equal amounts of work. So I find that interesting. So during times of crises, equality, right, brings out the best of us. Oregon, speaking of Oregon, so since people were started to migrate to Oregon, there was a little issue, just like we were talking about, remember, discovery, superior use. There was discussion between the United States and Great Britain, who actually owns Oregon. Britain kept saying that we own Oregon, but the United States said, no, we want Oregon now because our people are moving there en masse. One editor of the London Times stated, Oregon will never be wrested from the British crown, to which it belongs, but by war. A very hearty statement made by a Brit, because at that point in time, the United States had already had various skirmishes and wars with Great Britain after the Revolutionary War, and essentially Great Britain did not remain as a strong, great player in North American politics. And so we have the continuation of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was in the early 1800s. Obviously, we're fast forwarding now into the mid and late 1800s a bit more, but it's still worthy to say. So the Monroe Doctrine was from President Monroe, I believe from, let me just double check so I'm not giving you any wrong information here, when the doctrine was actually laid down. I believe it was 1916, but let me just check. 1823. Yeah, 1823. So in 1823, Monroe Doctrine was laid down, and so President Monroe was stating that no European colony, country, dominion, empire, whatever, shall, without our consent, be any part of the North American continent. So essentially what he's saying is, because previously North America was a fighting ground between the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, right? Everyone was trying to get a piece of the pie. And so the U.S. president here was essentially saying, this is our hood now, this is our part of the territory now, you have no say in it. And so all of this kind of mantra started to get risen again because of the Oregon Trail. If you've ever read Little House on the Prairie, this is a great little book and story on some of the experiences going through the Midwest, the Great Plains, and sod houses that were built at that time, little kind of log cabins right here and there that settlers were making, was all cute and stuff. But there's one thing that the Great Plains have that is absolutely terrifying: tornadoes. What? These huge spiraling swirls of air that suck you and your cattle and your babies up, and that's it. You're just like flying around until you die. And so, yeah, those like cute little sod houses that they will make just blown over. So if you have time, watch this video link at the bottom here. And it just details, how life was like under the tornado reality. Tough times. Here we have Miss Wilder, the author of Little House on the Prairie. The book modeled after her own life and upbringing, actually. So, federal assistance. We already spoke of the Homestead Act of 1862. The U.S. government actively tried to bring in more immigration, right? Because as a growing country, a growing nation, a growing empire, whatever throughout history you want to discuss, a higher population definitely helps, right? Because you want your nation or your center of power, whatever it's going to be throughout history, but you want it to grow and expand. And so over this policy, the U.S. government ended up transferring over 270 million acres of land. Not too shabby. We also had the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. So Congress here essentially wanted to build more transcontinental railroads. And so they understood that the railroads were the beating heart of a new America, because the railroads were making transportation that much faster. They were making goods and services easier. And if the United States could build up the railroad lines and systems, then the United States would be at an even more advantageous position. Here we have the Transcontinental Railroad from the east and the west meeting at a certain point. And once the eastern and western railroads from both sides of the U.S. kind of migrated and actually met, they had a huge ceremony with champagne, alcohol, spirits, and especially for railroads, when you're laying down track, right, you have to kind of nail in these kind of large nails into the track to keep it in place. So as the ceremony here, they nailed in a gold spike, right, into the ground. I don't know about you, but if I was at the ceremony and I saw there was a huge gold spike being thrust into the ground, I would have partied, said hi to everybody, waited till 4 a.m. and then perhaps dug out dug out that golden pike, and just come home and be like, honey, we don't have to work anymore. Oh my goodness. But yeah, it was definitely a nice little treat that they had. Pushing westward towards California, because we spoke about California a little bit in the gold rush. What were some experiences like for some of the locals, right? For some of the Mexicanos. California, at that time was a huge bustling state. It had over 100,000 people by 1848, and it had a select social hierarchy. And their social hierarchy was descended from the Spanish Empire, from a very European mindset. And it serves well for us to look at this because it completely differentiates itself from the American capitalistic model. So this old European structure was a very structured, pyramidic social hierarchy, right? At the very top, you had the Californios, the Mexican elite. They were typically more white, more Spanish. They had more Spanish blood in them. They owned most of the land and the good jobs. The mestizos were half Spaniards, half locals and natives. Artisans, soldiers, vaqueros, small farmers, etc. For my GCC fam, the vaqueros, the GCC Vax, okay, that is our alma mater. So that is like our, identity. So the vaqueros here. And then at the very bottom of the totem pole would be Native Americans, because they had no Spanish blood in them. And so this being compared to the United States model of doesn't matter what bloodline you are, you can make whatever you want of yourself, right? Hypothetically on paper. And so, many folks were starting to get a little disgruntled over this over time, as you might imagine. The gold rush of 1849 was that huge moment that we spoke of earlier, and people wanted to quote-unquote strike it rich. The Land Act 51 tried to resolve a bunch of confusing land titles because people were just grabbing up land titles wherever they could. However, on the board of trustees, it was mostly controlled by whites. And so they started to systematically go through and make sure that the proceedings were in English. And typically they wanted to strip Mexicans of their land because to make way for white migrations, right? The best example of this was Salvador Vallejo. He was a rancher in Napa Valley, and spent a decade and nearly $100,000 of his own money because he was a wealthy individual. Spent almost all his money, lost his wealth, trying to fight them in the courts, but the courts were rigged against him. And so eventually squatters just ended up forcing him to sell his land. And so even one of the wealthier aristocrats of California, right, ended up, without his land and his fortune being spent in vain. Part 4, the last part, Chinese immigrants and Chinese experiences. Arguably one of the quintessential most American things in history, of U.S. history, were the Chinese building the railroads. And we're going to get into that soon. Especially all of our discussions of China right now, right? It's interesting to talk about all this stuff. Chinese immigration from the United States was... it predated 49. I'm not going to say there was no Chinese immigrants before 1849, but more heavily, just because of the gold rush, right? Like large amounts, they started pouring into California and the U.S. And so for those few decades, nearly 300,000+ Chinese immigrants came in. Some legally, a lot illegally, through various ports and cities and ferries. It just depended. However they can get here, they got here for work. Some reasons for them leaving China at the time. China itself was having a population explosion of 400 million. So things were getting a little crowded. Their agriculture at that time was not that effective, and so they had less food than people, and so starvation started to come into play more times than not. And so food was starting to be a very big issue for them. European imperialism. The colonial powers of Europe began to gobble up China and impose unfair trade regulations on them. And so many of them felt that they needed to get out. And the Taiping Revolution, the rebellion, excuse me. In the 1850s, there was an uprising between the Chinese and British officials because of that pushback to European imperialism. And so it resulted in 20 million dead. Things were not going too hot within mainland China, and so people thought to themselves, why not go to America, earn some money, perhaps send the money back to our family, or bring our family here and kind of resettle, etc. And so once they heard about the quote-unquote Golden Mountain, or California and its gold rush, they started to come to the United States en masse. Now, many of them came single men. It was easier for them to travel, as you might imagine. In the 1800s, traveling as a single man was a lot safer and easier than traveling as a single woman, for obvious reasons. But they started coming en masse. Let's say if they were just coming as single men, they started to send money back home so that they could, support their families. In some cases, they came, with their families, but that came later. It was a little more rare. And so, many of us can, parallel our own lives with this. If you have friends or family or relatives living abroad, many of us send money back home to wherever the home country is, whether it's Armenia, Russia, Mexico, whatever. And these folks were trying to do the same thing to better their family's life. And so, from all those single men that were coming to, the United States at the time, they started to show that they had a unique Chinese identity, right? And so Americans started to see more Chinese culture than ever before. And so they saw that the Chinese culture was very patriarchal, right? The eldest male of the household was, right, the patriarch. Very close-knit family relations. You must have respect for your elders, right? If your elder says something, then you have to abide by it. And worshiping your ancestors, right? Remembering them, paying homage to them is very important. Now, a lot of them, once they came to the States, they tried to bring their culture here, opening stores, cultural venues and fairs and whatever else. And so over time, over 100,000 Chinese started to live in America, right? By the 60s, right? They're, by the close of the American Civil War in the West, we had over 100,000 Chinese individuals living in the United States. And so, a lot of them initially came for gold, but eventually they were settling down and building communities here. There's something called the Bachelor Society. So because most of these migrants initially were men, because they came here to work and send money back home, they got the nickname of Bachelor Society. And so this was a string of anti-Chinese racist rhetoric against them, saying that, oh, well, they're just coming here to defile our daughters, and look at these Chinamen, they're dressed so weirdly, and instead of a kind of European clean-cut haircut, they have like this long braid. We don't get it. And so, huge string of negative stereotypes started to occur, and they started to get categorized as people of color or Orientals because they were non-Western, they were non-white, and they were non-Christian. It was very difficult for the American population to really accept them at this time because they didn't have a lot of commonalities. And so stereotypes of the Chinamen being gamblers, loving prostitutes, being ridden with crime in their communities, and having opium smoking dens. And so the kind of quintessential picture, right, the stereotypical picture would be a Chinaman wearing his traditional garb and having this long braid, smoking at an opium den with your daughter that he has defiled, and he is gambling on the side, right, with his other gambling friends because they're all part of the crime syndicate or whatever, right? All of these negative stereotypes were created, obviously, but that's just from a clash of culture, mainly. But it's interesting to see that they were so stigmatized because, well, like I said before, one of the most American things you can possibly think of is if your ancestors worked on the construction of the railroads of the United States. The railroads are so quintessentially kind of Wild West, right? If you think of West history, not Western history, but let's say United States history of like the Wild West. Cowboys, railroads, gold rush, right? Those are kind of very, very big quintessential markers. Many of them constructed the railroads, right, en masse. The Chinese immigrants were used as a enormous source of labor for the railroads. And so, although they were still called coolies and, kind of like the, Orientals here and there, many of them have strong roots, in my opinion, to call themselves Americans, especially their kids and grandkids that started becoming Chinese Americans, right? And so here's a primary source photograph of an actual family dressed up in traditional garb, right? Getting ready for a family portrait. And so definitely interesting to see all of the culture kind of intermixing. Here we can see on the right-hand side Chinese immigrants working alongside their white compatriots on the left, sifting for gold, right, during the gold rush. Here they are used, unfortunately, many times when it was very dangerous to use dynamite and blast into the mountains for mining or even railroad operations. If they have to build a railroad going through the mountain, the Chinese would be sent in with the dynamite because they're expendable. And so many of them had very difficult and harsh jobs. But they built the railroads of this country, and like I said before, they have just as much credit, especially if they settled down here and they had families here, to be one of the greatest Americanized family stories ever, right? Because let's say if you're the child or the grandchild of these individuals, you can say, like, my grandfather built the railroads of this country, and that was enormous to say. And here's a few of them working on the railroads as well, right? Excellent primary source photos. And here is a close-up of these individuals working. And so I can't imagine what their lives were like, every single one of them, coming from their families, coming from various parts of China, all coming here to work and send money back home. But I can just imagine what kind of stories they would have to tell. Now, some of the more difficult legal aspects of Chinese coming to the United States was having legal hurdles. Because out of every single ethnic group within American history, the Chinese are the only ones to ever be completely banned from immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. We never had the Armenian Exclusion Act, or the Russian one, or the French one. The Chinese were the only ones in U.S. history that have completely been excluded from the United States as an entirety of a group. But let's go through this slide from the top to bottom and see kind of how that started to progress. So at this time, we're seeing nativist resentment and fears. Nativist means from the populace of the home country. Nativist fears mean you have a fear of immigrants, a fear of others coming in, right, to your country. So the nativist reactions to all of this was that these Chinese immigrants were too many. We needed to protect America. And so in the 50s up to the 60s, we started to see many counties in California expel Chinese miners. In the 70s, labor unions purposefully created anti-Chinese propaganda so that they could not find work as easily. In the 80s, the California state legislature itself denied Chinese official employment and prohibited them from working on dams or irrigation projects, the big and lucrative projects that they wanted, right? Also like railroads. And also later on, the California Supreme Court ruled that these quote-unquote Mongolians, now they couldn't say Chinese, but these Mongolians, could not testify against whites. And so obviously many instances of cases between whites and Chinese started to spring up because of this. San Francisco, hilariously enough, because today San Francisco is so liberal and PC and pro-LGBTQ, San Francisco during this day and age passed an ordinance prohibiting long hair, carrying baskets on long poles, or having single braids like most Chinese men did, traditional style, right? And then eventually the United States, on a federal level, passed the 1982 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the strongest U.S. legislation prohibiting immigration from China. It was the first time the United States had truly closed its doors to an entire group of people. The only one that I can think of in recent years, potentially, that would come close to this was, remember Donald Trump a few years ago? He implemented his Muslim ban on various Muslim countries. And so, although that's not excluding a single ethnic group entirely, that's more of a, I guess, religious ban of such. But in modern context, that's the closest thing I can think of, right, on such a large form scale. Here's a political cartoon detailing how California was seen treating these Chinese immigrants, right? Pacific chivalry, encouragement to Chinese immigration. And so it does not look like it was all too encouraging. And this is a famous one of my favorite political cartoons. This shows the United States of America, the gates of liberty, right? And on the left-hand side, it says who is allowed to come into the United States. Notice, communist, nihilist, socialist, Fenian, hoodlum, welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen. So every one of these folks who were quote-unquote terrible eventually in U.S. history at some point were all welcome, but the Chinaman was not. And so it's a very interesting and a poignant political cartoon to see. And with that, I leave you with Joe Biden. None of that malarkey, all right? And so that is the end of the chapter. I hope you had a good time. It's been a good run. And hopefully you learned a little more about Manifest Destiny, the pushing, the push onward into the West, of the mindset that some of these people were in, of the various skirmishes and wars that we had against Native Americans, Mexicans, and kind of all of that moving forward. And so as we keep pushing into our readings, we're going to get more and more into the late 1800s, and we are going to slowly start going into industrialization. And so during our conversations about the railroads, that is going to be a good early onset conversation of what is to come. True industrialization of the United States. Large cities being built, skyscrapers, railroads, steel, right? And all these robber barons that are going to amass absolute fortunes. And so stay tuned for the next lecture. It has been an absolute pleasure. I hope you had fun, and I'll see you for the next lecture.